In the summer heat of Jerusalem, 1099, as Christian knights waded through streets running red with the blood of Muslim and Jewish inhabitants, a profound contradiction was taking root in the soul of medieval Europe. The very men who had sworn oaths to follow the Prince of Peace had just completed one of history's most brutal conquests in his name. From this paradox, this fusion of sacred devotion and sanctified violence, would emerge an institution unlike any the world had ever seen. The military religious orders, brotherhoods of men who took monastic vows yet carried swords, who prayed with the fervor of saints yet fought with the fury of professional killers. The knight monks who would soon emerge from the aftermath of the First Crusade were not accidents of history, but inevitable products of a civilization struggling to reconcile its highest spiritual aspirations with its most basic political necessities. In the conquered city where Christ had walked, where his cross had been raised, where his tomb lay newly liberated, Christian Europe would create something that was neither purely monastic nor purely military, but a hybrid that embodied all the contradictions of crusading civilization itself. The first of the great military orders emerged not from dreams of conquest, but from the simple Christian duty to care for the sick and dying. In the narrow streets near the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, a hospital dedicated to St. John the Baptist had operated for decades before the Crusader conquest, serving pilgrims of all faiths who had made the dangerous journey to Jerusalem. The Benedictine monks who ran this charitable institution might have continued their quiet work indefinitely, but the aftermath of 1099 would transform them into something unprecedented in Christian history. Gerard of Martigues, the Provençal monk who led the Hospital of St. John in those crucial early years, understood that charity without protection was meaningless in a land where Christian pilgrims faced constant danger from bandits, hostile populations, and the ever-present threat of Muslim reconquest. The decision to arm the Hospitallers was not made in a moment of religious fervor, but through the cold calculation of practical necessity. If they were to protect the sick and feed the hungry, they would first need to master the arts of war. The transformation of the Hospitallers from healers to warriors reveals the essential paradox that would define all the military orders. By 1136, when Pope Innocent II officially recognized their military function, the Knights of St. John had evolved into a dual organization that maintained hospitals throughout the Crusader states while simultaneously fielding some of the most disciplined heavy cavalry in the known world. A Hospitaller knight might spend his morning changing the bandages of wounded pilgrims and his afternoon charging into Muslim cavalry at full gallop, his sword blessed by the same God in whose name he offered succor to the dying. This fusion of mercy and violence created men of extraordinary psychological complexity. The Hospitaller rule required knights to care personally for the poor and sick, to serve them meals on bent knee, to address them as my lords in recognition of their spiritual dignity. Yet the same rule demanded absolute obedience in military matters and authorized the use of extreme violence in defense of Christian interests. The brothers who staffed the great hospital in Jerusalem, with its 1,000 beds and revolutionary medical practices, were the same men who rode out to raid Muslim caravans and storm the walls of enemy fortresses. If the Hospitallers embodied the tension between charity and warfare, the Knights Templar represented an even more radical departure from traditional monasticism. Founded around 1119 by Hugh de Paynes and a small band of French knights, the original poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, began as a modest association dedicated to protecting pilgrims on the dangerous roads between the coast and Jerusalem. What they became was something far more extraordinary: a multinational corporation with military capabilities, an economic powerhouse that helped create the foundations of international banking, and a fighting force so feared that Saladin would order the execution of captured Templars rather than risk their exchange or ransom. The early Templars occupied quarters on the Temple Mount itself, in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which the Crusaders had converted into a Christian church and dubbed the Temple of Solomon. This location was more than symbolic. It placed the nascent order at the physical and spiritual heart of the Crusader enterprise, literally above the ruins of Judaism's holiest site, and within what Christians believed to be the very precinct where Christ had cleansed the temple of money changers. The irony that the Templars would themselves become history's most successful international bankers was not lost on their critics, but it reflected the pragmatic genius that would make them indispensable to the Crusader states. Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential churchman of his age, provided the theological framework that transformed the Templars from a simple military fraternity into a new model of Christian knighthood. In his treatise In Praise of the New Knighthood, written around 1130, Bernard argued that the Templar represented a revolutionary fusion of the active and contemplative lives. Unlike traditional knights, whose violence served worldly ambitions, and unlike traditional monks, whose prayers served only spiritual ends, the Templars used sanctified violence to serve God's will directly. They were, Bernard argued, a new kind of knighthood unknown to past ages. Men who fought not for earthly glory but for heavenly reward. This theological innovation solved a problem that had plagued Christian thinkers for centuries. How could the Church embrace a warrior class whose profession seemed fundamentally incompatible with Christian teaching? The Templars provided the answer by creating a new category of holy warrior, the Miles Christi who killed not in sin but in righteousness. When a Templar knight drove his lance through a Muslim warrior, Bernard argued, he was performing a sacred act comparable to the prayers of a monk or the charity of a bishop. The success of both the Hospitallers and Templars in their military functions reflected more than religious enthusiasm or individual courage. These orders represented a military revolution that would transform medieval warfare and provide the Crusader states with their most reliable and effective fighting forces. Unlike feudal levies, which served for limited periods and owed primary loyalty to local lords, the military orders created professional armies bound by religious vows and maintained through institutional resources that transcended national boundaries. The tactical innovations pioneered by the military orders reflected their unique organizational advantages. Templar and Hospitaller knights trained together constantly, developing a level of coordination and discipline that feudal armies could rarely match. Their standardized equipment, unified command structure, and shared tactical doctrine allowed them to execute complex maneuvers that would have been impossible for traditional knightly forces. When chroniclers described the military orders as the backbone of the Crusader armies, they were acknowledging not just their fighting ability, but their role in introducing systematic military organization to medieval warfare. The Battle of Montgassard in 1177 exemplified the military orders at their most effective, when Saladin led a massive army of over 30,000 men into the Kingdom of Jerusalem. King Baldwin IV could field fewer than 5,000 defenders. The core of his force consisted of perhaps 80 Templar knights and a similar number of secular knights, supported by a few hundred infantry and crossbowmen. By any rational calculation, the Christian force should have been annihilated. Instead, through careful positioning, perfect timing, and the disciplined charge of the military orders, Baldwin's army routed Saladin's vastly superior force in one of the most stunning victories of the crusading period. The key to victory lay not in individual heroism, but in institutional excellence. The Templar and Hospitaller Knights, who formed the heavy cavalry corps of Baldwin's army, had trained together for years, knew each other's capabilities intimately, and could execute tactical maneuvers with a precision that made their small numbers devastatingly effective. When they struck Saladin's army, they hit not as a collection of individual warriors, but as a unified instrument of war guided by shared doctrine and mutual trust. While the great international orders were establishing themselves in the Holy Land, a parallel development was taking place on the Iberian Peninsula, where the long struggle against Islamic rule was creating its own distinctive military-religious institutions. The Spanish Reconquista shared many characteristics with the Eastern Crusades. It was a war of religion that promised spiritual rewards for military service. It attracted international participation, and it created similar needs for permanent military forces capable of defending vulnerable frontiers against constant Muslim pressure. The Order of Calatrava, founded in 1158, emerged from a crisis that perfectly illustrated the intersection of spiritual and military concerns that defined all the military orders. When the Templars surrendered the fortress of Calatrava la Vieja, declaring it impossible to defend against Almohad attacks, King Sancho III of Castile offered it to any religious community willing to take on its defense. The Cistercian abbot Raymond of Fitero accepted the challenge, creating a new religious military order that would become the largest and most powerful of the Spanish military orders. The Order of Santiago, founded around 1170, represented an even more radical departure from traditional monasticism. Unlike other military orders, the Knights of Santiago were permitted to marry, reflecting the practical necessities of frontier warfare and the distinctive cultural traditions of Iberian Christianity. This innovation allowed the order to attract knights who were unwilling to accept clerical celibacy, while still binding them to the cause of Christian expansion through religious vows and institutional loyalty. The Spanish military orders developed their own distinctive character, shaped by the particular demands of the Reconquista. Unlike their counterparts in the Holy Land, who fought to maintain precarious footholds in hostile territory, the Spanish orders participated in a gradually successful campaign of territorial expansion. Their castles became centers of colonization as well as military bases, and their knights often served as administrators and settlers as well as warriors. The fusion of religious, military, and colonial functions created institutions that were simultaneously monastic communities, military organizations, and engines of territorial expansion. The northern frontier of medieval Christendom presented its own unique challenges that would give birth to perhaps the most successful of all the military orders. The Teutonic Knights, founded in the Holy Land around 1190 as a German hospital order, found their true calling not in the deserts of Palestine, but in the forests and marshlands of the Baltic region, where Christian missionaries and German settlers faced determined resistance from pagan Lithuanian, Prussian, and Livonian tribes. The transfer of the Teutonic Knights from the Holy Land to Prussia in 1230 marked the beginning of one of medieval history's most systematic and successful campaigns of conquest and conversion. Unlike the Crusader states, which remained precariously dependent on reinforcement from Europe, the Teutonic state in Prussia became a self-sustaining political entity that combined military conquest with systematic colonization and economic development. Hermann von Salza, Grand Master of the Teutonic Knights from 1209 to 1239, understood that the Baltic Crusade offered opportunities unavailable in the Holy Land. Instead of attempting to hold isolated fortresses in hostile territory, the Teutonic Knights could build a contiguous state through gradual expansion, systematic settlement, and the incorporation of conquered populations through conversion and cultural assimilation. The forests of Prussia became the laboratory for a new model of religious military colonialism that would profoundly influence the development of Eastern Europe. The military methods developed by the Teutonic Knights reflected the unique challenges of Baltic warfare. Unlike the open terrain of the Holy Land, where heavy cavalry could be deployed to maximum effect, the dense forests and marshy ground of Prussia favored infantry tactics and siege warfare. The Teutonic Knights became masters of fortress construction, creating a network of stone castles that served simultaneously as military bases, administrative centers, and symbols of Christian authority. Their systematic approach to conquest, building castles, clearing forests, establishing towns, and converting populations, created a template for European expansion that would be employed from Ireland to Hungary. Among the most poignant of the military orders were the Knights of Saint Lazarus, an institution that embodied, perhaps more clearly than any other, the fundamental contradictions of crusading ideology. Founded to care for lepers, the most feared and despised outcasts of medieval society, the Order of Saint Lazarus evolved into a military organization that fielded knights who were themselves afflicted with the disease that medieval Christians saw as divine punishment for sin. The sight of leper knights charging into battle, their diseased faces hidden behind helmets, their rotting hands gripping lance and sword, must have been one of the most disturbing spectacles of the Crusades. These were men who had lost everything that medieval society valued: health, beauty, family connections, hope of earthly prosperity, yet who continued to fight for the cause that had brought them to the Holy Land. Their very existence challenged fundamental assumptions about divine justice, human dignity, and the relationship between physical corruption and spiritual purity. The Leper Knights represented the crusading ideal pushed to its logical extreme. If the military orders embodied the fusion of monastic and martial virtues, the Knights of Saint Lazarus carried this synthesis to its ultimate conclusion by embracing both holy war and holy suffering. Their willingness to continue fighting despite their affliction demonstrated a commitment to the crusading cause that transcended all earthly considerations. They had nothing left to lose and everything to gain through martyrdom in holy war. The castles built by the military orders represented more than military engineering. They were statements of theological principle rendered in stone. The great fortress of Croix de Chevaliers, held by the Hospitallers, dominated the gap between the Lebanon and anti-Lebanon mountains for over a century, its massive walls and sophisticated defenses making it virtually impregnable to direct assault. But the castle's true significance lay not in its military effectiveness, but in what it represented: the permanence of Christian rule in the Holy Land, the technical superiority of Western civilization, and the divine protection that the military orders claimed for their cause. The architectural innovations pioneered in Crusader castles reflected the unique challenges faced by the military orders. Unlike European castles, which primarily needed to withstand brief sieges by feudal armies, Crusader fortifications had to resist prolonged attacks by sophisticated enemies equipped with advanced siege technology. The concentric defenses, multiple baileys, and carefully designed approaches of castles like Croix de Chevaliers represented state-of-the-art military architecture that influenced fortress construction throughout Europe. But these castles were more than military installations. They were also monastic communities. Within the massive walls of Croix de Chevaliers stood not only barracks and armories, but also chapels, libraries, and scriptoriums where knight brothers copied manuscripts and maintained the intellectual traditions of their orders. The same men who manned the siege engines and led cavalry charges also participated in the canonical hours of prayer that structured monastic life. The bells that called defenders to the walls also summoned them to divine office, creating a rhythm of life that seamlessly integrated warfare and worship. The military order's success in maintaining their fighting capacity over generations required not only spiritual commitment, but also sophisticated financial management. The Templars, in particular, developed banking techniques that revolutionized medieval commerce and provided the economic foundation for sustained military operations in the Holy Land. Their international network of preceptories served not only as recruitment and training centers, but also as financial institutions that could transfer funds across vast distances without the risks associated with transporting physical currency. The economic innovations pioneered by the Templars reflected their unique position as international religious organizations with local military responsibilities. A knight joining the order in France might bring land that would be managed by Templar preceptories throughout Western Europe, with the revenues ultimately supporting military operations in Palestine. This system allowed the military orders to mobilize resources on a scale that no secular institution could match, creating a form of international capitalism dedicated to religious warfare. The financial records of the military orders reveal the staggering costs of maintaining permanent military forces in the Holy Land. A single Templar knight required the revenues from several European manors to support his equipment, training, and maintenance. The heavy cavalry that formed the core of Crusader military power was perhaps the most expensive military technology of the medieval period, requiring not only costly equipment, but also years of training and the support of extensive logistical networks. By the 1170s, the military orders had become so central to the defense of the Crusader states that their effectiveness would determine the very survival of Christian rule in the Holy Land. The rise of Saladin as ruler of Egypt and Syria created the most serious challenge the Crusader states had faced since their foundation, and the response of the military orders would reveal both their greatest strengths and their most dangerous weaknesses. The Battle of Hattin on July 4th, 1187, marked the end of the first great age of the military orders. The devastating defeat that cost the Crusader states their field army, their king, and ultimately the city of Jerusalem, resulted from a series of strategic and tactical errors that revealed the limitations of military institutions built around religious rather than purely military considerations. The pride that made Templar and Hospitaller Knights so effective in individual combat became a fatal weakness when it prevented them from accepting strategic retreat in the face of superior enemy forces. The behavior of the military orders in the aftermath of Hattin illustrated both their strengths and their contradictions. Saladin, recognizing the particular danger posed by the military orders, ordered the execution of captured Templars and Hospitallers while sparing secular knights for ransom. The religious knights who had taken vows of poverty could not be bought, who had sworn obedience to their orders rather than secular lords could not be turned, and who believed that death in battle against infidels guaranteed immediate entry into paradise could not be intimidated. They were, from Saladin's perspective, the most dangerous enemies of Islamic rule precisely because they were the most committed Christians. Yet even in defeat, the military orders demonstrated the institutional resilience that would allow them to survive disasters that destroyed secular institutions. While the Kingdom of Jerusalem collapsed and its nobility was killed or scattered, the international networks of the military orders remained intact. The Templars and Hospitallers who died at Hattin were replaced by new recruits from Europe. Their castles were rebuilt with funds from Western preceptories, and their military capabilities were reconstituted through the same institutional mechanisms that had created them originally. The fall of Jerusalem in October 1187 marked not the end of the military orders, but their transformation. The institutions that had been created to defend the Crusader states would now be called upon to reconquer them, and the Third Crusade would test whether the fusion of monastic discipline and military effectiveness that had made them successful could adapt to the changed circumstances of the late 12th century. As news of Jerusalem's fall reached Western Europe in the autumn of 1187, the military orders found themselves at the center of the greatest mobilization of the medieval period. The Third Crusade would bring together the most powerful rulers of the Christian world: Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip Augustus of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of the Holy Roman Empire, in an attempt to undo Saladin's conquests and restore Christian rule to the Holy City. But the military orders that would participate in this great expedition were fundamentally different from the small brotherhoods of knights that had emerged in the early 12th century. They had become international institutions with their own political agendas, economic interests, and strategic priorities that did not always align with those of secular rulers. The Templars and Hospitallers who would fight alongside Richard the Lionheart were not merely military auxiliaries, but independent powers whose cooperation could not be taken for granted. The contradictions that had been present from the beginning, between monastic humility and knightly pride, between Christian charity and holy violence, between spiritual poverty and institutional wealth, had grown more pronounced as the military orders accumulated power and responsibility. The same vows that made them effective warriors also made them difficult allies, and the same institutional structures that gave them staying power also made them resistant to outside control. The Age of Innocence, if it had ever existed, was over. The military orders that emerged from the wreckage of the First Kingdom of Jerusalem would be harder, more pragmatic, and more politically sophisticated than their predecessors. The simple faith that had driven the early Crusaders was being replaced by institutional calculation, and the dream of permanent Christian rule in the Holy Land was giving way to more limited and realistic objectives. Yet even as they evolved, the military orders retained the essential characteristics that had made them unique: the fusion of religious commitment and military capability, the subordination of individual will to collective purpose, and the belief that violence in service of the Christian faith was not merely permissible but sanctifying. These principles would be tested in the crucible of the Third Crusade, and their ultimate validation or refutation would determine whether the experiment in sacred warfare that had begun in the aftermath of the First Crusade would survive the challenges of the 13th century. The stage was set for the confrontation that would define the mature phase of the military orders. The meeting between the disciplined fanaticism of the Templars and Hospitallers and the strategic genius of Richard the Lionheart played out against the backdrop of Saladin's determination to maintain Islamic control of Jerusalem. The outcome would determine not only the fate of the Crusader states, but the future evolution of institutions that had already begun to transcend the particular circumstances of their creation. When Richard the Lionheart arrived at Acre in June 1191, he found the military orders transformed by 2 years of desperate siege warfare. The Templars and Hospitallers who greeted him were no longer the relatively simple brotherhoods of the early crusading period, but hardened veterans of a conflict that had stripped away many illusions about the nature of holy war. They had learned to cooperate with secular rulers when it served their interests and to resist them when it did not. And they had developed their own strategic vision for the recovery of the Holy Land that did not always align with royal ambitions. The Siege of Acre had become a microcosm of the challenges facing the Crusader enterprise. The city's massive fortifications, built by successive Islamic rulers and strengthened by Saladin himself, could not be taken by simple assault. Victory required sustained effort, sophisticated siege technology, and the kind of disciplined coordination between different Christian forces that had been lacking at Hattin. The military orders, with their permanent commitment to the Holy Land and their institutional memory of successful siege warfare, had become indispensable to the enterprise. Yet Richard's relationship with the military orders was marked by tension as well as cooperation. The Templars and Hospitallers had their own agendas, their own strategic priorities, and their own understanding of what constituted acceptable losses in pursuit of victory. When Richard ordered a general assault that the Templars deemed premature, they had no qualms about refusing to participate. When the Hospitallers disagreed with royal policy toward Muslim prisoners, they made their opposition known through passive resistance rather than open defiance. The fall of Acre on July 12, 1191, demonstrated both the effectiveness of cooperation between the military orders and secular authority and the limits of such cooperation. The final assault succeeded because Richard's tactical genius combined with the institutional discipline of the military orders to create an irresistible attacking force. But the aftermath revealed the fundamental differences in worldview that separated the king from the Knight brothers who served under his nominal command. Richard's massacre of Muslim prisoners at Acre horrified even some of his own followers, but it was accepted by the military orders as a necessary act of war. The Templars and Hospitallers had learned through bitter experience that mercy toward Muslim enemies was often repaid with renewed attacks on Christian positions. Their support for Richard's harsh measures reflected not bloodthirstiness, but the cold calculation of men who understood that the survival of the Crusader states required a level of ruthlessness that secular rulers, with their broader political concerns, might find difficult to sustain. The advance from Acre to Jaffa in the summer of 1191 became a masterpiece of medieval military coordination that showcased the military orders at their most effective. Richard's strategic plan required a degree of discipline and mutual trust that feudal armies had rarely achieved, and the success of the enterprise depended largely on the reliability of the Templars and Hospitallers who formed the advance and rear guards of the Christian army. The march south revealed the tactical innovations that the military orders had developed through decades of warfare in the Holy Land. Their formations were more flexible than traditional heavy cavalry, their response to orders more immediate, and their ability to maintain formation under pressure more reliable. When Saladin's light cavalry harassed the flanks of the Christian column, the military orders responded with a combination of disciplined defense and devastating counterattacks that gradually wore down Muslim morale. But the march also revealed the psychological cost of the military orders' effectiveness. The same religious fanaticism that made them fearless in battle also made them impatient with the strategic restraint that Richard knew was necessary for ultimate victory. The Hospitallers, serving as rear guard during the approach to Arsuf, were subjected to constant harassment by Muslim forces that struck and withdrew before effective retaliation was possible. The frustration of being unable to respond immediately to these attacks tested the discipline of men who had taken religious vows that included obedience to military authority. The Battle of Arsuf on September 7th, 1191, became the defining moment of the Third Crusade and demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of cooperation between the military orders and secular leadership. Richard's battle plan required the Christian cavalry to absorb punishment from Muslim archers until the optimal moment for a decisive charge. But this demanded a level of restraint that went against every instinct of knights trained to respond immediately to enemy attacks. The premature charge by the Hospitallers that initiated the battle might have been a disaster if Richard had not possessed the tactical flexibility to turn their indiscipline into victory. When the rear guard finally broke formation and charged the Muslim lines, Richard immediately committed his reserves and transformed what could have been a piecemeal defeat into a crushing victory. The battle demonstrated that the military orders could be controlled by commanders who understood their psychology and capabilities, but it also showed that such control required constant vigilance and tactical adaptability. The aftermath of Arsuf revealed the complex political dynamics that now characterized relations between the military orders and secular authority. The Templars and Hospitallers had proven their military value beyond question, but they had also demonstrated their capacity for independent action that could either support or undermine royal strategy. Richard found himself dealing not with simple military subordinates, but with autonomous institutions that pursued their own understanding of Christian interests in the Holy Land. The negotiations that followed Arsuf showcased the military order's evolution into sophisticated political actors. When Richard entered into diplomatic contact with Saladin's representatives, the Templars and Hospitallers insisted on participating in the discussions not as advisors, but as independent parties with their own interests to protect. They understood that any eventual peace settlement would affect their institutional position in the Holy Land, and they were determined to ensure that their concerns received appropriate consideration. The military order's approach to diplomacy reflected their unique perspective on the conflict with Islam. unlike secular rulers, who might accept territorial compromises in exchange for political stability. The religious orders viewed the struggle for the Holy Land in apocalyptic terms that made partial solutions difficult to accept. Their willingness to negotiate with Muslim authorities was purely tactical, designed to achieve temporary advantages that would ultimately serve their goal of total Christian victory. This fundamental difference in outlook created persistent tension between the military orders and Richard's broader strategic objectives. The king understood that permanent reconquest of Jerusalem might be impossible with the forces at his disposal, and he was willing to consider arrangements that would guarantee Christian access to the holy places without requiring the city's return to Christian rule. The military orders, while not rejecting such compromises outright, made clear their belief that any settlement short of complete victory represented a betrayal of the crusading ideal. The acquisition of Cyprus by Guy de Lusignan in 1192 created new opportunities for the military orders, while also presenting them with difficult strategic choices. The island's position between the Holy Land and Western Europe made it an ideal base for supporting continuing operations in Palestine, but its distance from the main theaters of conflict also made it tempting as a refuge from the increasing pressures facing the remaining Crusader territories. The Hospitallers' decision to establish major facilities in Cyprus reflected their transformation from a purely Palestinian institution into a truly international organization with strategic interests throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. The Order's investments in Cypriot infrastructure, agriculture, and fortification demonstrated a level of long-term planning that secular authorities rarely achieved, and their success in developing the island's resources provided them with economic independence that enhanced their political autonomy. But the Hospitaller presence in Cyprus also revealed the growing gap between the military order's institutional interests and the immediate needs of the Holy Land. Resources invested in Cypriot development were resources not available for the defense of Acre, Antioch, or the remaining Crusader strongholds on the mainland. The criticism that the military orders were becoming more concerned with their own institutional survival than with the cause they had been created to serve was not entirely unjustified. The architectural achievements of the Hospitallers in Cyprus, particularly their massive fortress at Colossae and their sophisticated hospital facilities in Nicosia, demonstrated both their continued commitment to their founding principles and their adaptation to changed circumstances. These were not merely military installations, but comprehensive institutional complexes designed to support all aspects of the Order's mission: military, medical, economic, and spiritual. The final siege of Acre in 1291 marked the end of 2 centuries of continuous Christian rule in the Holy Land and forced the military orders to confront the possibility that their foundational mission might no longer be achievable through traditional means. The Mamluk siege, conducted with systematic efficiency by Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, demonstrated that the technological and organizational advantages that had once favored Christian defenders had been overcome by Islamic military innovation. The defense of Acre revealed both the continued courage of the military orders and the limitations of courage when unsupported by adequate resources and strategic vision. The Templars and Hospitallers who died on the walls of their last great fortress in Palestine demonstrated the same commitment to their cause that had characterized their predecessors for 2 centuries. But their sacrifice could not compensate for the broader failure of Christian Europe to provide sustained support for the Crusader enterprise. The final assault on May 18, 1291, became a funeral pyre for the ideals of the early crusading period. The Grand Master of the Templars, Guillaume de Beaujeu, died sword in hand defending the walls he had sworn to hold. The Marshal of the Hospitallers, Matthew de Clermont, led a hopeless sortie that ended with his death and the death of most of his companions. These were not deaths chosen in despair, but acts of faith that affirmed the continuing validity of the principles that had guided the military orders since their foundation. Yet even in defeat, the institutional structures that had sustained the military orders for 2 centuries demonstrated their resilience. While the last defenders of Acre were dying at their posts, Hospitaller and Templar administrators in Cyprus, Rhodes, and Western Europe were already planning for the evacuation of surviving personnel and the preservation of institutional resources. The fall of the Holy Land did not mean the end of the military orders, but rather their transformation into something new. The retreat of the Hospitallers from the Holy Land to Cyprus and then to Rhodes represented more than a geographical relocation. It marked their evolution from a continental to a maritime power that would dominate the Eastern Mediterranean for over 2 centuries. The conquest of Rhodes in 1309 demonstrated that the order's military capabilities had not been diminished by the loss of Palestine, but rather adapted to new circumstances that required naval rather than cavalry expertise. The transformation of the Hospitallers into the most formidable naval power in the Eastern Mediterranean reflected their institutional adaptability and their continued commitment to the struggle against Islamic expansion. The galleys that sailed from Rhodes harbor carried the same red crosses that had adorned Hospitaller shields at Hattin and Acre, but they represented a new form of Christian military presence in the East that was more flexible and sustainable than the territorial conquests of the early crusading period. The Siege of Rhodes in 1480, when Mehmet II's massive Ottoman fleet was repulsed by the island's Hospitaller defenders, demonstrated that the military orders remained capable of achieving stunning victories against overwhelming odds. The successful defense, led by Grand Master Pierre d'Aubusson, showed that the combination of religious motivation, professional military expertise, and superior fortification that had characterized the military orders since their foundation could still prove decisive in the right circumstances. But the Hospitaller state in Rhodes also revealed the contradictions that had been present in the military orders since their foundation. The island's prosperity depended largely on piracy directed against Muslim shipping, activities that were difficult to distinguish from mere banditry except for the religious motivation of the perpetrators. The wealthy merchants and comfortable burgesses of Rhodes City enjoyed a standard of living that seemed to contradict the vows of poverty that the order's knights had sworn. Yet the Grand Masters argued that institutional wealth was necessary to support the continuing struggle against Islamic expansion. While the Hospitallers successfully adapted to their new circumstances, the Knights Templar found themselves trapped by contradictions that would ultimately destroy them. The loss of the Holy Land had deprived the Templars of their original mission without providing them with an obvious alternative, and their immense wealth and political influence had made them enemies among the very secular authorities they had once served. The accusations brought against the Templars by Philip IV of France in 1307 reflected not only royal greed for their assets, but also genuine concerns about an institution that had grown too powerful for its own good. The charges of heresy, blasphemy, and sexual misconduct were almost certainly fabricated, but they gained credibility because the Templars' secretive practices and enormous wealth made them convenient scapegoats for broader anxieties about the relationship between spiritual and temporal power. The trial and execution of Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Templars, on March 18, 1314, marked the end of the most powerful military order of the medieval period, as the flames consumed the man who had led the order through its final crisis. They also consumed the dream of an autonomous Christian military force that could operate independently of secular authority. The Templars had become too successful for their own survival, and their fate served as a warning to other military orders about the dangers of excessive political ambition. Yet even in destruction, the Templars demonstrated the enduring power of the ideals they had embodied. Jacques de Molay's final speech from the stake, in which he maintained his innocence and predicted divine vengeance against his persecutors, became a rallying cry for later generations who saw in the Templars' fate a symbol of spiritual integrity destroyed by worldly corruption. The mythology that grew up around the Order's destruction would prove more influential than their actual historical achievements. While the international military orders struggled to redefine their mission after the loss of the Holy Land, the Spanish military orders found themselves at the center of the most successful crusading enterprise of the late medieval period. The final phase of the Reconquista, culminating in the conquest of Granada in 1492, vindicated the Spanish order's long commitment to the struggle against Islamic rule and demonstrated that the crusading ideal remained viable under the right circumstances. The transformation of the Spanish military orders from frontier warrior brotherhoods into instruments of royal policy reflected the broader evolution of medieval institutions in the face of changing political circumstances. The Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, understood that the military order's continuing effectiveness depended on their integration into royal strategy rather than their maintenance as independent actors. And the Orders of Santiago, Calatrava, and Alcantara gradually accepted royal control in exchange for continued relevance. The conquest of Granada represented the culmination of nearly 8 centuries of Christian expansion in Iberia, and the Spanish military orders played crucial roles in both the final military campaigns and the subsequent colonization of the conquered territory. The sight of Christian knights riding through the streets of Granada, their banners displaying the crosses of Santiago and Calatrava, marked the fulfillment of dreams that had sustained the Spanish Reconquista since the 8th century. But the success of the Spanish Reconquista also marked the end of the distinctive culture that had produced the Spanish military orders. The unified Spain that emerged from the conquest of Granada had less need for autonomous military religious institutions, and the orders gradually evolved from active military forces into honorific organizations that preserved the memory of past achievements while serving primarily ceremonial functions. The Teutonic Knights in Prussia represented perhaps the most successful adaptation of the military order model to changing medieval circumstances. By the 14th century, the Teutonic Order had created a territorial state that extended from the Baltic Sea to the borders of Poland, demonstrating that the combination of religious motivation and military efficiency that characterized the military orders could be successfully applied to large-scale political organization. The Battle of Grunwald in 1410, however, marked the beginning of the end for Teutonic political independence. The devastating defeat inflicted by the combined Polish-Lithuanian army not only destroyed the order's military supremacy in the Baltic region, but also called into question the fundamental assumptions on which Teutonic rule was based. The pagan enemies against whom the order had justified its existence had been replaced by Christian kingdoms that could claim equal legitimacy in the eyes of the Church. The gradual transformation of the Teutonic Order from a religious military institution into a secular duchy reflected broader changes in European political culture that made autonomous military orders increasingly anachronistic. When Grand Master Albert of Brandenburg converted to Protestantism in 1525 and transformed Prussia into a secular duchy, he was acknowledging that the medieval synthesis of religious and military authority was no longer sustainable in the modern European state system. Yet the Teutonic achievement in Prussia had lasting consequences that extended far beyond the order's own institutional survival. The systematic colonization, urban development, and administrative innovation that characterized Teutonic rule created the foundations for Prussian political culture that would ultimately influence the development of modern Germany. The discipline, efficiency, and commitment to collective purpose that had characterized the Teutonic Knights as a religious order became defining characteristics of Prussian secular administration. The transformation of the Knights of Saint Lazarus from leper knights into a more conventional military order reflected both the changing nature of medieval warfare and the gradual evolution of attitudes toward disease and social outcasts. As medical understanding advanced and leprosy became less common in Western Europe, the order was forced to redefine its mission while preserving the distinctive spiritual insights that had emerged from its founders' confrontation with mortality and suffering. The order's evolution from caring specifically for lepers to serving the poor and sick more generally demonstrated the adaptability that allowed some military orders to survive the collapse of the original crusading enterprise. By the 15th century, the Knights of Saint Lazarus had established hospitals and charitable institutions throughout Europe that continued their founders' commitment to serving society's most vulnerable members, while maintaining the military traditions that connected them to the broader history of the crusading orders. The spiritual legacy of the Leper Knights proved more enduring than their military achievements. Their example of finding meaning and purpose in the face of seemingly hopeless circumstances provided a model of Christian dedication that transcended the particular circumstances of the Crusades. The transformation of physical suffering into spiritual strength that characterized the early Leper Knights became a permanent contribution to Christian spirituality that outlasted the specific historical conditions that had given it birth. The final chapter of the great military order's medieval history was written on the fortified island of Malta, where the Hospitallers made their last stand as an independent military power. The Great Siege of 1565, when the Knights of St. John successfully defended their island fortress against the massive Ottoman fleet of Suleiman the Magnificent, represented both the culmination of centuries of military religious tradition and its final flowering before the modern world rendered such institutions obsolete. The heroic defense of Malta, led by Grand Master Jean de Valette, demonstrated that the combination of religious motivation, professional military expertise, and superior fortification that had characterized the military orders since their foundation could still achieve remarkable results against overwhelming odds. The successful repulse of the Ottoman siege was celebrated throughout Christian Europe as proof that the crusading spirit remained alive and effective in the 16th century. Yet even in victory, the Hospitallers faced the reality that their world was disappearing. The rise of national navies, the development of modern artillery, and the changing nature of European diplomacy were making autonomous military religious orders increasingly anachronistic. The knights who celebrated their triumph over the Ottomans were the last generation who could realistically claim to be continuing the medieval tradition of holy war. The transformation of the Hospitallers from active military participants to ceremonial guardians of tradition reflected broader changes in European culture that made the medieval synthesis of religious and military authority difficult to sustain. By the 18th century, the Order of St. John had become primarily a charitable organization that maintained hospitals and provided humanitarian services while preserving the memory of its military past through elaborate ceremonial and historical scholarship. The Protestant Reformation presented the surviving military orders with challenges that were both theological and practical. The fundamental Protestant critique of monastic vows and religious warfare called into question the basic assumptions on which the military orders had been founded, while the political fragmentation of Christian Europe made international religious organizations increasingly suspect to emerging nation-states. The Council of Trent's reaffirmation of traditional Catholic teaching on religious vows and holy war provided the surviving military orders with theological justification for their continued existence. But it could not restore the political unity that had made them effective in earlier centuries. The military orders that survived the Reformation did so by adapting to the confessional divisions of early modern Europe, rather than by transcending them. The transformation of several Teutonic commanderies into Protestant foundations demonstrated the adaptability of military order structures to different religious contexts, but it also marked the end of the international Catholic unity that had been essential to the order's original mission. The Protestant military orders that emerged from this transformation preserved some organizational features of their Catholic predecessors, while abandoning the theological framework that had given them meaning. By the 17th century, most of the surviving military orders had evolved from active military institutions into ceremonial organizations that preserved the memory of medieval crusading, while serving primarily symbolic functions in early modern European society. The elaborate rituals, magnificent regalia, and historical pageantry that characterized the later military orders reflected their transformation from functional organizations into repositories of cultural memory. The Order of the Golden Fleece, founded by Philip the Good of Burgundy in 1430, represented a new model of chivalric organization that emphasized ceremonial magnificence and courtly ritual rather than military effectiveness. While technically not one of the crusading orders, the Golden Fleece demonstrated how the ideals and organizational structures pioneered by the military orders could be adapted to serve the representational needs of early modern monarchy. The survival of the Hospitaller tradition in various national organizations throughout Europe showed how the memory of the military orders could be preserved and honored even when their original functions had become obsolete. The transformation of military necessity into cultural tradition allowed the essential insights of the military orders. The value of disciplined service, the importance of collective commitment, and the possibility of finding transcendent meaning through institutional loyalty to survive the collapse of the medieval world that had created them. The 18th century Enlightenment's critique of religious enthusiasm and institutional privilege threatened the survival of the remaining military orders by calling into question the fundamental assumptions on which they were based. The philosoph's emphasis on reason over faith, individual liberty over institutional loyalty, and utilitarian calculation over traditional honor created an intellectual climate hostile to organizations that embodied medieval values. The French Revolution's dissolution of the ancient military orders within its territory marked the end of an institutional tradition that had survived for 7 centuries. The revolutionary critique of privilege, superstition, and international religious authority struck directly at the foundations of military order identity, while the practical need for national unity made autonomous religious organizations seem dangerously anachronistic. Yet even as the Enlightenment seemed to destroy the last remnants of the medieval military orders, it also created the conditions for their romantic revival. The Gothic revival movement's fascination with medieval institutions, the romantic emphasis on individual heroism and spiritual quest, and the emerging nationalist interest in historical traditions combined to create new appreciation for the achievements of the military orders. The 19th century revival of interest in the Templars, Hospitallers, and other military orders reflected not so much historical scholarship as cultural nostalgia for a world in which spiritual and military virtues could be successfully combined. The neo-medieval organizations that claimed descent from the original military orders preserved some of their ceremonial traditions while abandoning the theological framework that had given them meaning. The story of the military orders reveals the fundamental tension between spiritual idealism and political reality that has characterized Western civilization since the medieval period. The attempt to create institutions that would embody perfect Christian virtue while operating effectively in an imperfect world ultimately failed. But the failure was so magnificent and the attempt so ambitious that it continues to inspire admiration and emulation centuries after the original organizations disappeared. The modern world has seen numerous attempts to recreate the synthesis of spiritual commitment and practical effectiveness that characterized the medieval military orders. The international humanitarian organizations that emerged from the chaos of 2 world wars, the elite military units that combine intense esprit de corps with exceptional professional competence, and the religious communities that dedicate themselves to serving society's most vulnerable members all reflect, in different ways, the continuing appeal of the military order model. Yet the fundamental contradictions that ultimately destroyed the medieval military orders remain unresolved. The tension between individual conscience and institutional loyalty, between spiritual purity and political effectiveness, between universal ideals and particular interests continues to challenge organizations that attempt to serve transcendent purposes through worldly means. The history of the military orders suggests that such contradictions cannot be permanently resolved, but must be constantly managed through the practical wisdom of leaders who understand both the necessity of compromise and the importance of maintaining commitment to fundamental principles. the architectural monuments that survive from the age of the military orders. The massive walls of Croix de Chevaliers, the elegant chapels of Templar commanderies, the sophisticated fortifications of Rhodes and Malta, stand as permanent witnesses to an experiment in sacred warfare that shaped the development of European civilization. These stones speak of faith and doubt, triumph and failure, sacrifice and ambition intertwined in combinations that resist simple moral judgments. The cultural legacy of the military orders extends far beyond their direct institutional descendants. The ideal of the Christian knight that they embodied became a permanent feature of Western literature and imagination, influencing everything from Arthurian romance to modern popular culture. The notion that spiritual commitment can enhance rather than compromise practical effectiveness, that collective loyalty can transcend individual self-interest, and that ordinary human beings can achieve extraordinary things through dedication to transcendent purposes remains as compelling today as it was 8 centuries ago. Perhaps most importantly, the military orders demonstrated that institutions created for specific historical purposes can evolve and adapt to serve broader human needs when their original functions become obsolete. The Hospitallers' transformation from crusading warriors to international humanitarian organization shows that organizational forms pioneered in one historical context can find new life and meaning in completely different circumstances. The ultimate significance of the military orders lies not in their military achievements, impressive though these were, but in their demonstration that human beings are capable of creating institutions that embody their highest aspirations while remaining effective in pursuing practical objectives. The synthesis of prayer and warfare that defined the medieval military orders may seem foreign to modern sensibilities, but the underlying challenge they faced, how to organize collective action in service of transcendent values, remains as relevant today as it was in the age of the Crusades. The bells that once called Templar knights to prayer and battle have long since fallen silent, but the questions they raised about the relationship between faith and action, individual conscience and institutional loyalty, spiritual idealism and political reality continue to echo through the centuries. In wrestling with these eternal human dilemmas, the military orders earned their place not only in the history of medieval Europe, but in the continuing story of humanity's search for meaning and purpose in an imperfect world. Their legacy reminds us that the greatest human achievements often emerge from the attempt to reconcile seemingly irreconcilable contradictions, and that institutions capable of inspiring both devotion and criticism, both admiration and condemnation, are more likely to leave lasting marks on history than those that seek only comfort and consensus. The military orders succeeded not because they resolved the fundamental tensions of human existence, but because they embraced those tensions fully and transformed them into sources of creative energy that reshape their world and continue to influence ours. In the end, the sacred brotherhood of the military orders stands as testimony to both the possibilities and the limitations of human ambition in service of divine purpose. Their story is neither a simple tale of heroic achievement nor a straightforward narrative of institutional corruption, but something more complex and more true to the actual texture of human experience. A record of ordinary people attempting extraordinary things, succeeding partially and failing magnificently, leaving behind them monuments both of stone and of spirit that continue to inspire and instruct those who come after. the cross and the sword, the prayer and the battle cry, the vow of poverty and the accumulation of wealth, the commitment to peace and the practice of war. These contradictions that define the military orders continue to define the human condition itself. In learning to live with such contradictions rather than resolving them, the military orders achieved a form of greatness that transcends their particular historical circumstances and speaks to the eternal struggles that shape all human institutions and all human lives. Subscribe and welcome to the Empire.